All right, let's get it underway. So why regulate fisheries at all? Francis talked about many centuries ago about non-regulation. So I'd like you to read this statement by T.H. Huxley, who was an influential figure in British fisheries management way back in the 19th century. And this is what he said. I believe that the cod fishery, the herring fishery, pilchard fishery, mackerel, probably all the great sea fisheries are inexhaustible. That is to say that nothing we do seriously affects the numbers of fish. Any attempt to regulate these fisheries seems consequently, from the nature of the case, to be useless. So what I just want you to do a very short mind's eye reflection on that comment. So close your eyes for a moment, and with your internal mind's eye, think about what a fishery would look like without any attempt to regulate. 20 seconds, 30 seconds. Any attempt to regulate these fisheries, because it seems, consequently, from the nature of the case, to be useless. Think about what the fishery might look like. 20 seconds, 30 seconds, have a think. And what are the images that come up in your mind? Open your eyes if you haven't already. These are some of the images that present us in today's modern world. We can forgive Huxley right back in the 19th century, perhaps, because industrialisation hadn't taken hold of our fisheries. I'm not sure what images that statement conjured up for you, but these are just some examples of what could happen and what has happened without proper regulation. What you wouldn't have seen, I would have expected, is something like this. Our communities smiling, happy, and being able to catch the quantities of fish that they need to survive. This is an old slide dated back to 2014, which basically says, and I doubt whether it's changed too much over the last 10 years, 87% of the world's fish species are exploited, overexploited, or have collapsed. Now that's a staggering statistic, and something that we should be very concerned about, and we are, which is why we're here today. What I want to talk about through this presentation is the fact that MCS and enforcement is inseparable from fisheries management. The sustainability of our coastal resources depends on effectively managing, we all know that, we understand that, through various strategies, but it is also dependent on effective MCS and enforcement. Without it, we run the risk, without it being MCS and E, we run the risk of our fisheries not being managed correctly. The thrust or the theme of my presentation today is that MCS and E is often overlooked, or the importance of it is spoken about, but it is overlooked. So just a few observations from yesterday that I hope to touch on through the rest of the presentation. Francis said, this is how they play the game. It's a comment that resonated with me, and I'll talk to that a little bit later. Nuanced approach to coastal fisheries compliance, and I think it is. It's very nuanced, and we'll talk about a little bit of that through the next 30 minutes. Fishing is very emotive for people, yeah? Very emotive. It's a sensitive issue, but it's also a source of pride. And when Professor Vitiaki was here, he mentioned about some of the elders, catching the big fish. When I was a young boy, my uncle Joseph Nuhaka Napo trained me to fish. But one of his principles right back then was to catch the biggest fish, was to catch the most fish, because then you were looked up in amongst the community. It wasn't until some 10 years later, when I became a compliance officer, that he took me aside and said, "Boy, you are perfect for this job. I want you to protect our fisheries." And it's over these last 40 years that I've been involved with fisheries compliance in New Zealand and throughout the Pacific, and it is a subject dear to my heart. So I wish to convey some of these messages that previous speakers have spoken about. I have a slight, probably, variation to what Francis's view about the top-down, bottom-up. Francis mentioned the bottom-up approach to coastal fisheries. Yes, I agree, but I also think we need to work together, and there's a top-down approach so we can meet in the middle. And I'll talk to that a little bit. Kathleen talked about capacity constraints. I want to reference that in terms of capability constraints, in terms of our compliance officers, and I'll talk about some of the training programs that we're undertaking in order to address not only capacity but also capability. Organised crime, Kathleen mentioned that, I want to touch on that briefly, and having effective MCS. And for me, that's the key part of why I'm here, is having an effective and efficient MCS team. And it's very often people think that compliance officers or authorised officers, whichever term you use, just appear out of thin air. They don't. They need resourcing, they need ongoing training, they need support to have an effective compliance team. Without them, like Santa Claus is not going to come and do your enforcement for you. Neither is the Tooth Fairy, or who's the lady that waves her magic wand? Tinkerbell. Yeah. We need to focus on our compliance teams. And as I've mentioned, I think it's often overlooked by our seniors. So having an effective MCS, very, very important to me. Viv mentioned enforcement and deterrence. Two bedfellows that can't be separated. Often in some of the environments that I speak in, if I mention enforcement, people cringe. Oh no, coastal, we can't enforce. It's too hard. Yes, it's a challenge, but it needs to be done. And that's how we do that, which is the important thing, which is what I would like to sort of cover off today, just how we can go about that. And I want to introduce you to a compliance model that I think is useful and relevant to think about. Rules and compliance. Viv mentioned MCS, and E means nothing on its own. And he's so right. It's interoperable for fisheries management. We need a management plan, we need a coastal-based fisheries management plan, but we also need compliance to make them effective and make them work. And we had Francisco talked about the carver bowl, and that's the same point. Everything's interoperable. It works to support each other. Without one, we don't get the other. He also mentioned IUU is not just one thing. Absolutely right. It's a multitude of different issues that we need to cover. And the one I'm talking about today is just one. He also mentioned I was interested in the MRAG study in terms of quantifying IUU, where it was found that 89% of the IUU fishing in the offshore was misreporting. Now, I've put in brackets there, not tick box inspections. From my observations so far, a lot of the inspections we do are around checking that the licence is valid, checking that the log's been filled in. It's the next step that is not done well, and it made me think about just reversing the figures a little if we put 89%, at the moment I think we put 89% of our NCF efforts go into that tick box, that 11%, which is not the right approach that we should be taking. But I was encouraged by the fact that Francisco's observation is that this is changing and that more of our effort is going into identifying and dealing with that 89%. The tick box inspections are easy, and that's why it ends. I've got no figures to support that. I've just reversed what Francis was explaining to us. So the presentation overview is I want to distinguish between profit-driven and what I've called their survival-driven IUU. I want to introduce you to two versions of a compliance model called VADE, V-A-D-E, and it's a compliance response to enforcement issues, really. It's how you respond. And I want to give you two variations of that particular model. And lastly, I'd like to focus on SPC, which is where I'm currently based in Namur and working with SPC, and some of the initiatives that we are looking at and trying to deliver in terms of MCS for the Pacific. So we all know and understand IUU fishing practices pose a serious threat to the vitality and vibrance, the economic benefits. I'm not going to dwell on these too much because they've been covered by other presenters. So there's no point in me going through those specifically. Just to note that they are very common drivers and threats to our coastal fisheries. So the current state of play, and I've sort of mentioned this earlier, is identifying the unders that relate to MCS and enforcement. So there's a huge variation in the delivery of professional compliance services across the Pacific. Some have no coastal MCS capacity, or very little, while others have dedicated coastal units and offices. However, in my opinion, as I said earlier, we often pay lip service to MCS and compliance. There's no support given to it, no thought given to, okay, how should we set up our compliance teams? How do we train them? How do we resource them? Everyone agrees that MCS is needed, national teams are needed, but in many cases they're underfunded, they're under-resourced, understaffed and under-trained when it comes to the detection and investigation and processing of serious IUU matters. So I mentioned earlier these two phrases, intentional IUU fishing and IUU fishing for subsistence. And the distinction lies primarily in the motivations. And I think when we look at our compliance responses in our MCS teams, we need to think about what the motivations are for some of that IUU fishing that we detect. For me, I'm a little more blunt. Intentional IUU fishing is solely focused on greed and indicated by the dollar signs for the two E's in the word greed. Money is why there is IUU fishing. And there's various forms of how people try to sidestep the system to get that money. IUU fishing for subsistence, particularly in small-scale fisheries, is driven by necessity, and that was touched on this morning by Kathleen about how often it's perceived that the coastal fisheries are impacted by the industrial fleets and are the low-hanging fruit in terms of compliance. So for me, the distinction is the intent behind the actions. It's profit-driven versus survival-driven. And what's important, and the point I want to make through this, is the key for me is how we respond from an MCS and compliance approach. How we respond to those two distinctions, and that's what is important. So I'll just make this comment: intentional profit-driven IUU fishing is the most insidious problem known to modern fisheries management. So I stated earlier on, we can have the greatest fisheries management plans in the world, but if they're not supported with MCS, there is always going to be that element that is going to undermine that plan through illegal fishing. So there is nothing that will destroy a fisheries management plan, community-based management plan, an MCS strategy so thoroughly and fully as letting intentional IUU roam free. That's the challenge for the compliance team, along with support from the fisheries management as well. Profit-driven IUU doesn't arise because you've got fishers that are ambivalent about fisheries compliance rules. It arises because of a lack of targeted enforcement, which comes back to that 89% in terms of the misreporting. We should be targeting our resources to deal with that 89%, not with the 11% with the tick boxes, which currently a lot of the compliance teams focus on. And we want to create this culture of voluntary compliance, and that's the gold standard, voluntary compliance, but it's extremely difficult and challenging to get to. And we'll never get total voluntary compliance. There is always going to be those people who, because of greed, ignore the rules. While everyone discusses IUU fishing, it often seems that people view addressing the issue as someone else's responsibility rather than confronting the persistent offenders directly. And that's my quote. And I think that's where we want to change the emphasis a little bit in terms of not only offshore but also in some of the coastal fisheries scenarios as well. But I caveat that, and I ask you to keep in your mind, it's not from a contemporary Western approach. That's one approach. It's a blend with our customary and traditional sanctions and compliance approaches as well. And that's why it's I felt privileged to actually listen to Professor Vetiaki this morning because of his views on traditional and customary law enforcement, if you will. And that's what we are trying to achieve with some of the work that we are doing through SPC, with all of the different members that make up the community. Coastal challenges to implementing MCS strategies. Again, I'm going to flick through these pretty quickly. I've highlighted the ones that I particularly wanted to focus on. The limited resources and capacity for enforcement. The cultural factors that come into that, and that was explained to us very clearly this morning. The tension that often arises between formal regulations and traditional fishing practices, and the tension between contemporary legislative systems and traditional customary sanctioning practices. So in SPC, we are trying to blend these and merge these together so that we have a Pacific worldview on how to deal with IUU fishing in our coastal fisheries. Just in here, as part of our training, you'll see two of our young authorised officers. If this is from Vanuatu, creating awareness and raising awareness in the community about the regulations and why they're important. Just one approach of being involved. Well, hopefully everything's okay out there. But involving the community, you know, and explaining what the rules are and why they are important. What I wanted to just touch on here briefly is something that Kathleen brought up about organised crime. I like to view organised crime more as organised groups of people as opposed to gangs, although gangs are a very high profile in organised crime, obviously. But it doesn't have to be a gang, it can be individuals. And I have direct experience of organised crime in New Zealand dealing with power, which is our abalone, you would probably refer to it. Power is the national abalone for New Zealand. But it's essentially, without going through that in too much detail, I was involved in an operation where we targeted organised gangs, organised groups of people who were involved in organised crime and the power chain of buying, of recruiting fishers to go and fish the power, middlemen that would buy it and then sell it to the end user, who would often, it would be exported overseas, probably to China. We know it went to Hong Kong. The point I want to make is that if you don't think organised groups of people are operating in your coastal fisheries, then you are mistaken, particularly around the Bestemere fish stocks, because it is happening. And it will continue to happen unless we target it directly. How many of you know what that is? And this comes back to the comments that Francis made about the game. It's a game. Does anyone know what that is? Yes, speak up. Don't be afraid, because I think you know. Shark fin what? Yeah, it's been shredded, yeah? So the illegal players, these organised groups of people, we've upped our game on shark fins, detecting shark fins and taking compliance action against them. So they've upped their game. Now they shred shark fins. So it's harder for us to detect. Not only are they shredding shark fins, they're also shredding Bestemere now. So this is the game that's played. It's a serious game, obviously. It's not a friendly match. Excuse me, I'm just going to take a drink of water. It's a serious game that has been played all based on greed. So for me, delivering professional compliance service in a coastal fisheries context is something I want to touch on. I want to talk to you about the VADE model of compliance response. Some of you may have already been exposed to it or are aware of it. So I'm going to skip over this in the essence of time. Skip over that too. So VADE, model of compliance. It's a graduated response to address fisheries offending. We have VAD, which stands for voluntary compliance, the gold standard. Assisted compliance, directed compliance. Each of those have an increasing level of compliance response. The first one, voluntary, we want to get engaged with the community, get out in the community, be seen, explaining why these rules are important and why you should adhere to the rules. Anyone that doesn't or is not, after all of our maybe we're looking at handing out brochures, we're putting up posters, that type of thing. Anyone that fails to sort of follow the rules, we take the next step, which will be to advise them of the consequences of not, from a sanctions point of view. What could happen if you don't comply? The next is directed. If we go back a third time, they're still not following the rules, okay, the response ups. It's up a level. Next time I'm back, you can expect some further escalated response from me as a compliance officer. Finally, the last response is this enforcement. And this is where people tend to, in a coastal setting, where we're trying to get community involvement, people reel back and a little bit queasy. I don't want to prosecute my people, but think about it this way. If I am voluntarily complying with the rules, because I understand the need, but my neighbour, fish stall seller here, is not, what is that going to lead to? It's going to lead to me reassessing my voluntary compliance. So we have to deal with people, recidivists, that don't respond to our, what we could call compassionate compliance, through the voluntary assisted and directed phases of the compliance response. At some point, we have to take people to task, and it's a hard job. It's challenging. So part of the training that we are doing with our members and authorised officers through SPC is giving them the skills and the knowledge, the enforcement tradecraft skills and knowledge, to be able to have the confidence to actually deal with some of these situations that they come up against. It's not easy. And if any of you have ever been a compliance officer or haven't, think about what it's like to approach somebody and seize something from them. How do you deal with them if they get, you take the size of Francisco, yeah, and look at me. How do I deal with Francisco if he gets a little bit testy? You need skills and training to be able to deal with situations like that. And this is what we're trying to do with some of the training programs that we're initiating. Oh, I'm mindful of my time. So compliance management, even if we go the enforcement step, we can provide a written warning. It might be a spot fine before we get to that prosecution, that ultimate step. So what I'm trying to emphasise to you, even though we talk enforcement deterrence, it's a graduated response in almost every case, unless it's intentional IUU. Then for me, we skip VAD, we go straight to E. So when you've got someone offending based on greed, the response automatically goes to E. But that's what we need to train our compliance officers to understand as well. So enforcement should be proportional to the level of offending detected. For those queasy about using the VADE model or enforcement and deterrence, think about value, the V being value, community engagement, developing a shared understanding, sustainable practice and benefits for everybody, voluntary. Awareness, educate the public, work collaboratively with communities, use the media, tell stories, promote collective recognition about the need. Desire, positive reinforcement, and that was, Kathleen touched on that this morning, about offering people to comply by offering them incentives to do so. So promote a culture of stewardship. Enablement instead of enforcement. Enablement, empowerment of our authorised fisheries officers, making sure the legislative frameworks are set properly, that they're appointed properly, they understand their powers, they're trained, they have resources and support, and they have the confidence to enforce the rules professionally. And I think that's something very key to MCS and compliance as well. It's being able to do your role professionally. Right. So cutting through all of that, and doing so we ensure that small-scale coastal fisheries thrive for generations to come, and safeguarding the very lifeblood of Pacific Island communities. So just moving on to SPC specifically now, and the things that we are trying to introduce and reinforce through our compliance training, is we have a USP SPC Certificate 4, which is focused on advanced skills for MCS officials. We've just developed a professional certificate in communities fisheries compliance, which is aimed to be launched in 2025. It's based at the community level, and both certificates ensure officials and community professionals are prepared for effective enforcement and resource management. With the Certificate 4, I just wanted to touch on this because it's undergoing a review at the moment, and we're reviewing it to align it with modern MCS and enforcement practices in a coastal sense, coastal context. It's made up of 4 courses. The fourth course is the one I want to touch on, delivering professional compliance services for coastal fisheries. It's undergone a total rewrite this year. Course 4 covers why we need compliance, why we need enforcement. We look at the inspection process. You know, it's not, you don't just get your warrant and go and talk to a fisher or a fish store holder. There's a process to follow logically so that you can do that in a professional manner. Likewise, if you detect an offence as a compliance officer, what's that enforcement process? What steps do you need to take? And then the last topic is the prosecution process. So what we're trying to instill, if you haven't seen the Ocean Wardens video, it's on YouTube called Ocean Wardens. I suggest and I would implore you to go and watch that. That outlines the standard of professional compliance services that we would like our officers to aspire to. So please take the time to have a look at that. We talk about in course 4 how to manage a non-compliant inspection if someone like Francisco becomes difficult. Yeah, how do we deal with a big blob like that? Yeah, big man. Yeah. I also just wanted to mention here as well, in terms of gender, some of the best compliance officers I've worked with in New Zealand are female. So it's not a man's world. It requires both men and women to be compliance officers, and women bring a far different perspective to it. Men want to stand up and fight, yeah? Women can bring those tensions right down and still achieve the aim. What we don't want is people fighting. We don't encourage that. We don't reinforce that. So all of the techniques we talk about is how to manage that, whether you're male or female or a combination team. You should never be working on your own. How to manage difficult people, asking the appropriate questions. You know, you've detected an offence. What questions do you ask? If you've never done it, it's not easy. And it takes time to learn the process. The very first time I had to seize a boat back in New Zealand, like now, very nervous. Little Adam's apple going up and down. I have to seize this boat off an angry man. But it's the training that reinforces and gives you the confidence to do that in a professional manner without getting into a fist fight. These are some of the things that we're covering off. I've highlighted the last line there. I believe senior fisheries managers need to do a compliance course so that they understand the challenges that their compliance officers face and actually try to do the job themselves in a controlled environment even. It's still a challenge. So we are looking next year to develop a course specifically aimed at helping senior compliance managers that have not done compliance work to give them an understanding of what it involves. So that's something that we're looking at. Sorry, Francis. Maybe just, go back. The second bullet point there, delivering compliance services requires a holistic and nuanced approach. This is for me where the customary traditional and the contemporary compliance approach need to blend together. Because often, perhaps in a coastal fisheries context, rather than prosecuting somebody, there is another means through traditional or customary sanctions to deal with offenders. So that's very, very important, and I want that theme to come through my presentation as well. Here is the certificate 3. I'll skip through that pretty quickly. Come back, one more. So there are 2 core subjects, community engagement and nearshore fishing. Core 2 is inspection and investigation within powers. And then you have to do a third, one of those 3 electives for the course on community-based management, safety at sea, biodiversity, for example. So there are 3 subjects in this certificate. It's going to be launched next year. And it's aimed at youth who aspire to be involved in fisheries. and also some of our older compliance officers that don't have formal qualifications, but they know their job, but they have got an opportunity here to actually provide and attain a qualification. We are also looking at emerging technologies, and in Kiribati we have running a trial there using electronic monitoring through the pelagic small-scale vessel tracking system. In Nauru, we are looking at a very similar trial to be able to track inshore fishing vessels, not only from a compliance or a monitoring perspective, but also from safety. You know, these people are going offshore, and they run, it's been mentioned before, you know, it's a very dangerous job, fishing. So safety is another very important aspect. Another key one I'll just touch on is the development of a regional MCSE inspection and compliance database. I've called it compliance decision making because a decision has to be made by somebody about what action is to be taken. And normally that's at a senior level. But we don't have any data. There's no data about coastal fisheries compliance. So we've just been working with Samoa, Tonga, Solomon Islands and Fiji on a needs analysis to develop a database that they're going to trial. So it's in its very early stages of development, but looking forward to seeing how that looks once the review has been done. Come on. I just wanted to finish off here. This is the last slide. This came through my newsfeed yesterday, and to me highlighted the blend between traditional and contemporary compliance approaches. Nelson, a Nelson woman, so Nelson's one of the small cities, small towns in New Zealand. She was fined $1,200 for taking 1,000 cockles from a traditional fishery reserve. So the example is, you know, in New Zealand we use mataitai and taipuri for closed areas and restricted fishing. But this particular woman, she ignored that, although she knew the closed area was there, she ignored it, she got caught, and she was fined $1,200. And the comments from the judge were interesting. Is if everybody did that, we would not have any cockles left in our country. So this lady Phelps took 8 times the daily limit and 1 pipi, which is a different species, while digging up the shellfish. Her lawyer said she got carried away, was doing something she did back in her native land in Thailand, but was still fined because of that. And that's the deterrence that will come. But again, she ignored the signs. So because there were signs up about the area being closed, and for traditional purposes. She ignored it even though she was aware of it. And for me, that's the intentional side. And that's where we go straight from, and using the VADE model, we sidestep VAD because we've done all of that with the signs and making publications about the closed area, and we go straight to E. So it's this nuanced approach using traditional and contemporary legal frameworks to help us control our fisheries. Look, I've gone well over time and I apologise for that. I had so much to say, so little time to say it, but thank you very much. Please just reflect on what I've said. I'm not preaching to you how you decide to approach your management of your coastal fisheries is up to you. And here we're just talking about specifically about MCS and enforcement and some approaches to it. So thank you very much.